An atheist professor thought he held all the cards until Barron Trump flipped the script with just one sentence. Dr. Graves wasn't just any professor. He was a force of nature. His lectures in Stanford University's philosophy department weren't ordinary lessons. They were full-blown performances. He didn't just teach. He dominated the room, wielding intellect like a weapon, slicing through belief systems the way a master craftsman might dismantle an intricate timepiece. His reputation stretched far beyond the walls of academia. Clips of his debates went viral, sparking fierce discussion. Some hailed him as a fearless advocate for reason, a warrior of logic in a world clouded by superstition. Others, however, saw him as a relentless skeptic, an arrogant intellectual who took pleasure in tearing down faith, brick by brick. His students? They knew exactly what they were in for. The first day of class was never just about introductions or a syllabus overview. It was a test. A game. A challenge. Dr. Graves would scan the room, his sharp eyes zeroing in on students wearing religious symbols, a cross on a delicate chain, a hijab wrapped with quiet dignity, a yarmulke resting atop a bowed head. And then, the questions would come, rapid, ruthless, designed to make them squirm. "So tell me," he would say, voice laced with amusement, "do you believe because you've explored every possible alternative or simply because it was drilled into you? If God exists, why hasn't he struck me down where I stand, right now, for mocking him? Do you ever stop to consider that faith might just be a psychological crutch? A comforting illusion for those too afraid to face reality as it is?" But it wasn't just the questions, it was how he asked them. That smirk, the challenging stare, the slight tilt of his head, as if daring students to respond in a way that wouldn't make them look ridiculous. Some tried. Some fought back with trembling voices. But most simply unraveled beneath his scrutiny, their words collapsing like a house of cards. He fed on that. And it wasn't just students who felt his razor-sharp intellect. His colleagues spoke of him with grudging admiration. Brilliant? Absolutely. But impossible to argue with? Even more so. Anyone stepping into a debate with Dr. Graves had to be ready for war, a war of words, logic, and ruthless precision. He had an uncanny way of twisting statements, leading his opponents down a path until they realized, too late, that they had walked straight into one of his verbal traps. Yet, for all his confidence, there was something about Dr. Graves that no one could quite figure out. Why did he despise faith so much? Some speculated that he had been raised in a strict religious household and rebelled against it. Others whispered that he had suffered a loss so profound, so painful, that it had turned him against the very idea of God. But Dr. Graves never revealed his past. He only made one thing clear. Faith was dangerous, illogical, and it had to be dismantled. Year after year, class after class, he played the same game. He took pride in breaking down religious students until they either abandoned their beliefs or learned to keep them hidden. He was undefeated, unshaken, until Barron Trump walked into his class. That semester, things would not go as planned. The lecture hall was packed, more so than usual. Some were there for the actual class. Others? They were there for the show. Dr. Graves had a reputation, and even students who weren't enrolled often snuck in just to witness him in action. Today was one of those days. The topic scrawled across the whiteboard. Faith in modern society, rational foundation or outdated myth. Dr. Graves leaned casually against his desk, sleeves rolled up just enough to give the illusion that this would be a relaxed discussion. But everyone in the room knew better. This was a battleground. And sitting near the center of it all was Barron Trump. Barron wasn't the type to blend into the background. At 6 feet 7 inches, he commanded attention without even trying. But it wasn't just his height, it was how he carried himself. While others slouched in their chairs or mindlessly scrolled through their laptops, Barron sat upright, composed, unreadable. For weeks, he had intrigued Dr. Graves. Not because of his last name, no, that carried little weight in this room. What made him stand out was his silence. Most students, when put on the spot, either shrank in intimidation or scrambled for an argument. Barron? He did neither. He simply listened, observed,
processed.
And when he spoke, it was never reactionary, it was deliberate. He never raised his voice, never got flustered. And there was one more thing. He always wore a cross necklace. A simple silver chain. Not flashy, not oversized, but present. Dr. Graves had been waiting for the perfect moment to challenge him. And today that moment had arrived. As he scanned the room, his gaze locked onto Barron's chest. No necklace. His smirk widened. "No cross today?" he asked, voice ringing through the room with calculated amusement. "I suppose faith was just a prop after all?" A few students chuckled. Nervous laughter, the kind that came when you knew something big was about to unfold. But Barron, he didn't flinch. He didn't shift in his seat. He didn't scramble for an excuse. He simply met Dr. Graves' gaze, steady, unwavering. A pause. A silence, so thick it pressed against the walls. And then, in a voice as calm as ever, he said, "If my faith was just a prop, you wouldn't feel the need to comment on its absence."
The air changed.
The smirk on Dr. Graves' face twitched, so subtle, so fleeting, that most of the students missed it. But Barron didn't. Silence stretched across the room, thick with something unspoken. Those who had been half listening now sat up, fully engaged. This wasn't playing out like the usual routine. This wasn't another moment where Dr. Graves effortlessly dismantled a student's belief.
No.
This time, something was different. And for the first time in years, it wasn't the professor who was in control. The weight of Barron's words settled over the room like the first rumble of an approaching storm. The students who had chuckled before were now silent, their eyes darting between Barron and Dr. Graves, waiting, anticipating his response. Dr. Graves, ever the master of debate, leaned back against his desk, arms crossed, his smirk creeping back like a reflex. "Clever," he admitted with a nod. "But let's not pretend that faith isn't largely performative. Most people wear symbols like armor because, deep down, they crave validation. Strip away the rituals, the prayers, the symbols, what's left?" But this time, the air was different, because Barron had already changed the game. Barron tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the question. Then, with calm certainty, he answered, "Conviction." Dr. Graves let out a short laugh, shaking his head. His smirk returned, but this time, there was something else beneath it, something harder to place. "And what does conviction mean without evidence?" he challenged, his tone dripping with skepticism. "You can be convicted about anything, flat earth theories, ghosts, fairies dancing in your backyard. That doesn't make them true." The professor leaned in slightly, waiting for Barron to stumble, to grasp for words. But Barron didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. And then he asked a question that caught the entire room off guard. "What about love?" Dr. Graves' eyebrows lifted slightly. "What about it?" he asked, intrigued but guarded. "You can't measure it. You can't pour it into a test tube or capture it under a microscope," Barron continued, his voice steady. "But people live for it. They die for it. They dedicate their entire lives to it. Does that make love an illusion?" A murmur rippled through the class. A few students exchanged glances. It was subtle, but something was shifting in the room. Dr. Graves opened his mouth to reply but then hesitated. It was only a split second, a flicker of pause that most students wouldn't have noticed. But Barron did. And he didn't wait. Leaning forward slightly, he delivered his next question with the precision of a well-placed dagger. "You always ask why people believe in God. Now, let me ask you something. Why do you care so much? Why does someone else's faith bother you?" That hit a nerve. For the first time, Dr. Graves' polished confidence wavered, not enough for the average student to pick up on, but just enough for Barron to see it. There was something in his eyes. Not just irritation, something deeper. Frustration? Resentment? A flicker of something even he might not have been ready to acknowledge. His response came a second too late. "I don't care," he said finally, though his voice carried an edge that betrayed him. "I challenge belief because it needs to be challenged. People should think critically. They shouldn't just follow blindly." Barron's gaze never wavered. "And you assume faith is blind?" Dr. Graves pushed off his desk, pacing toward the center of the room, as if physically reclaiming control of the discussion. Of course it is, he declared. You can't see God. You can't prove his existence. Faith demands that you accept something without evidence. That is the definition of blind belief. Barron shook his head slowly, his voice unwavering. No. Faith is believing in something even when you don't have all the answers. There's a difference. The professor scoffed. That's just a poetic way of justifying superstition. Barron met his gaze, without hesitation. Or maybe it's a sign that some things exist beyond what we can fully comprehend. The silence in the lecture hall deepened. The students weren't just listening anymore, they were watching something shift. For years, Dr. Graves had dismantled arguments like this with ease.
He had reduced them to dust.
But today, that dust wasn't settling the way he had expected. Dr. Graves exhaled sharply, adjusting his stance as if steadying himself for another round. He had debated theologians, scholars, even well-versed pastors before, and every time, cold, hard logic had won the battle. But this was different. Because Barron wasn't scrambling. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't trying to win. And that made him impossible to dismantle. The professor turned his gaze back toward the class, scanning the faces of his students. He needed to regain control. His voice shifted into full debate mode. Let's put it this way, he began, pacing slightly. If faith is about believing in something without seeing, then what stops anyone from believing in anything? You say faith isn't blind, but without evidence, how do you separate truth from myth? Barron remained calm, composed. You act like evidence is just numbers and formulas, he said. But people rely on things they can't see all the time. Justice, morality, human rights. You can't hold them in your hands, but we build entire societies around them. Are those myths? A few students straightened in their seats, eyebrows lifting. It was a simple argument, but it was landing. Dr. Graves smirked, regaining some of his usual confidence. Those things are built on reason, he countered. On agreed social contracts. They exist because we create them. Religion, on the other hand, asks us to believe in an invisible being governing the universe. That's the difference. Barron nodded, as if considering the point. Then he spoke again, measured and precise. So, if something exists beyond human creation, but we can't fully understand it, you dismiss it? Dr. Graves crossed his arms. I dismiss what can't be proven. Barron leaned in just slightly. Then prove to me that love exists. The professor scoffed. That's not the same thing. It is, Barron interjected, voice steady. You say love is real, but where's the proof? You can see people express love, but you can't put love itself under a microscope. You say morality is real, but where's the raw data? Just because something isn't physical doesn't mean it isn't real. A few students exchanged looks. Dr. Graves' jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't losing.
He refused to believe that.
But he wasn't winning either. Fine, he said, shifting tactics. Let's say I concede that some things exist beyond what we can measure. That still doesn't prove God. It doesn't prove that faith isn't just a comforting illusion. Barron tilted his head slightly. And what if it's not? Dr. Graves blinked. What? You always argue against faith as if the burden of proof is on believers, Barron said. But what if faith is real? What if there's something greater than what we can comprehend? You assume it's an illusion, but have you ever actually considered that maybe, just maybe, you're wrong? The room felt smaller, tighter. For the first time, Dr. Graves didn't have an immediate response. And the students felt it. The balance of power in the room had shifted. And this time, it wasn't in the professor's favor. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. Frustration? Amusement? Maybe even discomfort. Whatever it was, he masked it quickly, straightening his posture, arms crossed. You think you've turned the argument on me, he said, voice measured. But that's just rhetoric. The burden of proof is on believers. If I claim there's an invisible dragon in my garage, I can't expect you to prove it doesn't exist. That's not how logic works. Barron didn't flinch. He let the words settle before replying. But you're not arguing logic, Dr. Graves. "You're arguing certainty." The professor's brow furrowed slightly. "You speak as if there's no chance you could be wrong," Barron continued. "That's not logic, that's faith." A shift ran through the room. The student sat up straighter, eyes bouncing between the two. Barron leaned forward, his hands clasped. "You say faith is blind belief, but isn't it just as blind to assume nothing exists beyond what we can measure?" He paused. "You put your faith in human reasoning. I put mine in something greater." Dr. Graves exhaled sharply. "So you admit it's just faith?" Barron's expression didn't change. "I admit that everyone puts their faith in something. The difference is I acknowledge mine. You pretend you don't have." Dr. Graves' jaw tensed. It was such a simple question. But he knew the wrong answer could make him look like exactly what he claimed to despise. A man so sure of his own beliefs that he couldn't accept another possibility. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his chin, buying himself a moment. Finally, he spoke. "I don't deal in absolutes." His voice was measured, deliberate. "I question everything." Barron nodded, as if that was the answer he'd expected. Then, with the same calmness, he said, "Then question this. Why does faith bother you so much?" Silence. The kind of silence that didn't just fill a room, it shifted it. For years, students had watched Dr. Graves dismantle arguments with ease, cutting through them like a scalpel. But today, something was different. Something had changed. And for the first time in his career, Dr. Graves wasn't the one with the last word. But if there was one thing he hated more than faith, it was losing. He stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. For years, he had dictated the flow of these discussions, guiding students into intellectual corners where they had no choice but to concede.
But now?
Now, the room wasn't waiting for him to dismantle an argument. They were waiting for something else. An answer. And he could feel it, the weight of their stares. The girl in the back. The students shifting in their seats. And Barron steady, unshaken, waiting. Dr. Graves inhaled deeply, letting the silence stretch. He had debated religious scholars before. He had gone up against entire panels of theologians and left them grasping for words. But this wasn't an argument anymore. This was something else entirely. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower than before. "Faith doesn't bother me." He paused, as if weighing his next words. "What does bother me is how people use it. How they justify ignorance, violence, oppression. How they use God as an excuse to stop thinking for themselves." Barron studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Some do," he admitted. "But is that a problem with faith or with people?" Dr. Graves opened his mouth, ready to fire back, then hesitated. Barron leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You hold faith to a standard you don't hold anything else to." His voice was calm, steady. "Science has been used to justify eugenics. Politics has been used to justify war. Even philosophy has been used to justify some of history's worst atrocities. But you don't dismiss those things entirely. You separate the abuse from the truth. Why not faith?" A murmur ran through the class. For the first time, Dr. Graves looked tired. His hands gripped the edge of his desk. The discussion was still his, but he no longer controlled it. This moment was bigger than a debate. It felt personal. Barron watched him carefully, then spoke again, his voice softer now. "You always ask students why they believe in God." Dr. Graves glanced at him. "But have you ever asked yourself why you don't?" The silence was absolute. Barron wasn't trying to win. He wasn't trying to humiliate. The question wasn't an attack. It was an invitation. And that, more than anything else, was what made it powerful. For the first time, Dr. Graves didn't have a response. And for the first time, he realized he needed one. The lecture hall was silent, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was charged, expectant. Like everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for something that had never happened before. Dr. Graves had always been the one in control, the one who dismantled ideas and left them in pieces. But today, he wasn't standing over the wreckage of someone else's belief. He was standing in front of a mirror. His fingers tapped against the desk. Once.
Twice.
He wasn't sure how long he stood there, staring at nothing in particular. Maybe a few seconds. Maybe an eternity. He could feel the students watching him. Waiting to see if the man who demanded answers from everyone else would be willing to give one himself. Finally, he exhaled. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. I don't know. 3 words. Not sharp. Not dismissive. Not wrapped in layers of intellectual superiority. Just honest. Unpolished.
Real.
Barron didn't react right away. He didn't smirk. Didn't gloat. Didn't press further. He simply nodded, like that was all he had needed to hear. Dr. Graves cleared his throat, straightening. The edge in his posture returned, but something was different now. Less like a man preparing for battle. More like someone standing at the edge of something uncertain. Finally he spoke. Class dismissed. The students hesitated, like they weren't sure if the moment was really over. Then slowly, they gathered their things, filing out in murmurs. But the usual post-lecture chatter wasn't there.
No one was talking about the upcoming test.
Or weekend plans. Or what was for lunch. They were thinking. Barron gathered his bag, moving toward the door with the rest of them. But just as he reached the exit, Dr. Graves spoke again. Barron. Barron stopped, turning. The professor studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, I've had this discussion 1,000 times. And I've never once lost control of it. Barron didn't say anything. He just waited. Dr. Graves exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You didn't try to win. That's what made the difference. Barron considered that for a moment. Then with quiet certainty he replied, because faith isn't about winning. He didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded once, then walked out. Dr. Graves stood there for a long while, staring at the door long after Barron was gone. Maybe faith was just an illusion. Maybe it wasn't. But today, for the first time in his life, he wasn't so sure. Some debates aren't about proving who's right and who's wrong. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to argue. It's to make someone think.
Faith.
Logic.
Doubt.
They don't have to be enemies. They can coexist. And maybe, just maybe, the people who challenge us the most aren't the ones trying to tear us down. Maybe they're the ones asking us the questions we've been too afraid to ask ourselves. If this story made you think, let us know in the comments. And if you believe conversations like these matter, don't forget to subscribe for more.